For my final project, I wanted to look into the role social identity plays in sports and athletic activities. I specifically wanted to study how gender, race, and ethnicity play a role in grouping. Before I start my project, I wanted to review what social identity theory is. Social identity refers to the sense of self-identity and self-concept that comes from being a member of a certain social group. Social categorization, identity, and comparison are all components of social identity. Social categorization is the categorization of people in or out of our group. Examples of this are grouping based on race, age, or gender. Social identity refers to an individual's in-group, the group of people that they categorize themselves with. Social comparison refers to the out-group, who are the people that differ from an individual's own in-group. Individuals tend to favor their own group versus the out-group. To collect information that pertains to what I wanted to look at, I created a short survey that I sent out to 59 people in total. The participants consisted of friends, family members, and people that went to or still go to my high school, all who I know play a specific sport. Everyone I reached out to has played their sport or done their activity within the past year. I created the survey with general questions about participants' gender and race, along with an optional write-in box for ethnicity for those that wanted to fill that out. I then asked participants what sport they play and if they group themselves within their team in that sport. If they answered yes, I asked who they find themselves grouped with in regards to race and gender. Before I reviewed my data, I wanted to create a hypothesis. I hypothesized that women would be more likely to group themselves according to their race and gender versus men. However, I do think this is because women are more prone to grouping themselves with other women, regardless of race. I think that if men group themselves, they'll be more likely to group themselves with people from various backgrounds. However, I believe that both results will vary depending on the sport an individual plays. For example, a person of color playing a sport with only white teammates will be more likely to group themselves with white people, and vice versa, regardless of that individual's social identity. I sent my survey to 32 men in total, all of those who played various sports including basketball, football, soccer, lacrosse, golf, and report going to the gym. Although going to the gym isn't a sport, I did want to include it in my survey because I thought it'd be interesting to compare the difference between social identity and grouping between men and women in the gym. A majority of men answered that they were more likely to socially group and categorize themselves with people of any gender or race. Lacrosse was the one sport that was an outlier. As predicted in my hypothesis, this may be because it's a predominantly white sport. I reached out to 27 women with my survey, all who I knew participated in various sports or athletic activities. These activities and sports include basketball, gymnastics, soccer, lacrosse, golf, and again, going to the gym. Although the sample sizes and sports aren't the same between men and women in my survey, I did just want to look at the comparison of which gender would be more likely to group themselves a certain way regardless of sport. And I did find that women are more likely, although the data is kind of all over the place. The one statistic that was really interesting to look at was the amount of women that reported more likely to group themselves with their own gender, race, or ethnicity at the gym compared to men. So these are the percentages of men and women who are likely to create a group of people outside of their racial or gender demographics. I used bold font to denote the relevant data and the data I wanted to use because, as I mentioned before, not every sport had the same sample size between men and women, so I only wanted to look at the sports that had a very similar sample size. Before I further analyzed the data from my survey, I wanted to address potential errors. It was difficult to reach out to an equal amount of men and women that played the same sport. This means that although my results are accurate and I did report my findings from the survey, they also are misleading because the number of people surveyed per sport is inconsistent between men and women. Another issue I found in my survey was the very broad question I asked. I asked participants if they group themselves based on gender, race, or ethnicity. I could have created a more specific question instead of grouping those three together. This is a factor that potentially created error because, similar to what I predicted in my hypothesis, women are more likely to group themselves with other women. My survey accounted for gender, race, and ethnicity in the same question. Because of this, more women responded to grouping themselves with people like them, most likely on the basis of gender versus race or ethnicity. Accounting for potential error, I only pulled data from sports with similar sample sizes between men and women. These sports and athletic activities include basketball, soccer, and those who went to the gym. The data here shows the number of participants who group themselves not according to gender or race. Even with similar sample sizes, I found that men are significantly less likely to group themselves with their own gender or race in sports and athletic activities. I also noticed that these sports are sports played by all genders and races, and not necessarily dominated in one area. This is important because, as we saw before with the lacrosse statistic, those who play sports dominated by a certain race will be more likely to group themselves with that race. While looking for an outside study that I could compare the information from my survey to, I was unable to find a study that looked at the exact same things as I did. However, I did find a study from the National Center for Biotechnology Information titled Gender and Race Patterns in the Pathways from Sports Participation to Self-Esteem. In this survey, data was taken from an in-school survey of Caucasian and African American boys and girls. In this survey, around 18,000 Caucasian girls, 17,000 Caucasian boys, 4,000 African American girls, and 3,000 African American boys were sampled. This survey looked at students' home, school, and athletic situations. I specifically used the data on sports participation and self-esteem. The table shows the linear regression coefficients for sport and mediator variables in models predicting self-esteem by race and gender. Girls of both races were far less likely to participate in sports and have a high self-esteem within those sports. Although I realized the structure of my survey produced potentially misleading results, I was able to identify a correlation between my data and the data from the NCBI survey. Women may be more likely to socially categorize themselves with people of the same gender or race as them in sports because they are less likely to have high self-esteem in sports compared to males, according to the National Center for Biotechnology Information. In conclusion, women are more likely to socially identify with people similar to them in sports. This could be a direct result of social comparison. Women may be more prone to comparing themselves to another gender or race during sports because they are less likely to have high self-esteem during their sports or athletic activities. I was eager to create a survey and look further into this topic because it's something that not only pertains to the content we learned in class, but that I personally relate to. I play golf and I frequently go to the gym, and I find myself socially identifying with other women regardless of race. This is a direct result of my self-esteem caused by male dominance in both of these athletic areas. Even though this is my personal experience, I found that it still correlates to the data from the surveys I used, and the surveys yield the same results for women. Learning about social identity and social grouping during class made me think about how I identify myself in groups during sports, and I was curious to see how other athletes socially identify themselves. For my sources, I used the Social Psychology 12th edition textbook and the NCBI website for my outside survey. Thank you for watching my presentation, and thank you so much for an amazing semester.